What's going on, guys? So in today's video, we'll be taking an honest look at Gregg Popovich and the San Antonio Spurs dynasty, which officially began when the franchise chose Tim Duncan out of Wake Forest in the 1997 NBA draft. As the driving force of the franchise, Tim Duncan brought the Spurs to prominence by leading them to 5 NBA championships throughout his career, which included 3 in 5 years in the mid-2000s, alongside Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili. At the helm of this dynasty was Gregg Popovich, who served as both head coach and president of basketball operations for the Spurs, and who is recognized as one of the greatest coaches in NBA history. However, what many people are unaware of is how Gregg Popovich became the head coach for the San Antonio Spurs. During the 1994-1995 season, the San Antonio Spurs boasted the league's #1 record at 62-20, which was also a franchise best as they were led by first-year head coach Bob Hill and 1995 league MVP David Robinson, but would then lose in the Western Conference Finals to the Houston Rockets, who went on to become the 1995 NBA champions. The following season, the Spurs would finish as the 2nd seed in the Western Conference with a 59-23 record heading into the playoffs. But after getting past Charles Barkley, Kevin Johnson, and the Phoenix Suns in the first round, the Spurs would then lose to Stockton Malone and the Utah Jazz in 6 games of the Western Conference semifinals. But what came as a surprise and somewhat of a shock the following season was the firing of head coach Bob Hill, who had been the franchise's most successful coach up to that point after a disappointing 3-15 start to the season. During those first 18 games, the Spurs were without Chuck Person, who had been their best player off the bench the previous season, as well as All-Star center David Robinson, who was by far the team's best offensive and defensive player. Other injuries at that time also included Charles Smith, who had missed 14 of those first 18 games, and Will Perdue, who had missed 8 of the first 18 games. But despite that, Gregg Popovich, who was the general manager for the Spurs at the time, not only fired Bob Hill, but in the process promoted himself as the new head coach, just as David Robinson was set to be back in the lineup. But after David Robinson went down with a foot injury only 6 games after making his initial comeback, the Spurs, with Popovich as the head coach, decided to then purposely lose as many games as possible that season in the hopes of getting Tim Duncan in the 1997 NBA draft. And while the Spurs have always denied tanking that season, it must be noted that for one, David Robinson's injury, which was only supposed to take him out for about 6 weeks as many newspapers had reported, should have logically had him back on the court around mid to late February since he had gotten hurt on December 23rd. But instead, he mysteriously ended up sitting out the whole season. Then there's Chuck Person, who after injuring his back and undergoing surgery in October, was expected to miss the first 2 to 3 months of the season, setting his return for mid to late January. However, he also mysteriously ended up sitting out the whole season, much like David Robinson. In fact, the Spurs mysteriously choosing not to play healthy players was so obvious to the rest of the league that even Charles Barkley, who played for the Houston Rockets at that time and who has always been outspoken, was quoted in the papers saying, "When you rest healthy players so you can get the #1 pick in a draft, that's cheating. That's not the way the draft was designed." Now, fortunately for the Spurs, their tanking worked as they were able to get the #1 pick in the 1997 NBA draft, where they chose Tim Duncan out of Wake Forest, who for the next 20 years would help lead them to 5 NBA championships. Now, that era didn't necessarily end in 2016 after Tim Duncan retired, but more so this past offseason when Manu Ginobili retired and Tony Parker signed with the Charlotte Hornets as a free agent, while Danny Green and Kawhi Leonard were traded to the Toronto Raptors. But more than just the end of an era, these players were also a part of the Spurs' last championship team in 2014, where Kawhi Leonard was named Finals MVP. And while he was projected to be the future franchise player for the Spurs, His career in San Antonio took a turn for the worse during the 2017 Western Conference Finals after sustaining an injury while coming down on Zaza Pachulia's foot, raising many questions as to whether or not the play itself was dirty. And in the aftermath, it was Gregg Popovich who would then go on an emotional tirade calling the play dangerous, inappropriate, and dirty. However, Zaza Pachulia's play on Kawhi Leonard was very reminiscent of a former Spur in Bruce Bowen, who has his jersey retired with the franchise and who was oftentimes defended by Gregg Popovich for his dirty antics on opposing players during the 2000s.
A two-step lead with your foot closeout is not appropriate. It's dangerous, it's unsportsmanlike, it's just not what anybody does to anybody else. And this particular individual has a history with that kind of action. You can go back and look in Dallas games where he got a flagrant 2 for elbowing Patty Mills. The play where he took Kawhi down and locked his arm in Dallas and could have broken his arm. And then think about the history he's had and what that means to a team, what happened last night. A totally unnatural closeout that the league has outlawed years ago and pays great attention to it. And Kawhi's not there. And you want to know how we feel about it. But this is crap. And because he's got this history, it can't just be, oh, it was inadvertent. He didn't have intent. Who gives a damn about what his intent was? You ever hear of manslaughter? You still go to jail, I think, when you're texting and you end up killing somebody, but you might not have intended to do that. All I care is what I saw. All I care about is what happened. And the history there exacerbates the whole situation and makes me very, very angry. Nobody wants to do anything that would put anybody else in danger for a game or a career. This guy's history is different.
But even after all the video evidence, players and coaches' testimonies, as well as a phone call from the league office warning Bruce Bowen about stepping under jump shooters, Gregg Popovich not only continued to defend Bruce Bowen, but kept encouraging him to quote-unquote be Bruce Bowen and not change the way you play defense. Then there was Robert Horry's hip check on Steve Nash during Game 4 of the 2007 Western Conference Finals, which caused Amari Stoudemire and Boris Diaw to leave the bench, making them ineligible to play in a pivotal Game 5. And when asked about that foul, Gregg Popovich was on record stating that he didn't think the foul itself was quote-unquote such a big deal. So while the Zaza Pachulia criticism may have been well-deserved for his play on Kawhi Leonard, it was also very hypocritical coming from Gregg Popovich. Nonetheless, the following season, Kawhi Leonard's injury became a hot topic as tensions arose between himself and the organization concerning different aspects of his quadriceps injury and its rehab. However, in choosing not to play last season after an attempt at a comeback in December, not only did Kawhi Leonard take the smart and safe approach that other players forsook, but did so under the advice, care, and supervision of renowned orthopedic surgeon Dr. Jonathan Glashow, something his teammate Danny Green wishes he also would have done last season. Because unlike Kawhi Leonard, following a 2-week rehab, Danny Green continued playing through what was first diagnosed as a strained groin by the Spurs' medical staff, even though he would still quote-unquote feel it post-rehab. But as an MRI revealed at the end of the season, not only was the strain still there, but there was also a little tear. And although his own agent had advised him to get a second opinion, Danny Green had refused to do so because he quote-unquote had full faith and belief in the Spurs' medical staff. Then there's Pau Gasol, who had been originally diagnosed with left foot soreness by the Spurs earlier this season, and who was then out of his walking boot and working out on the court, but was then told to stop as the results of the second opinion came in with the diagnosis of a left foot stress fracture, taking him out indefinitely. However, this situation simply begs the question, why would the Spurs' medical staff clear Pau Gasol to resume basketball-related activities without protection prior to getting the results of the second opinion? In fact, isn't this the exact same situation as Kawhi Leonard, who much like Pau Gasol, had been cleared by the Spurs' medical staff and had attempted making a comeback in December of last year, but after feeling discomfort, seeked a second opinion in Dr. Jonathan Glashow, who recommended Kawhi Leonard deactivate. Unfortunately, this Pau Gasol story, which broke on November 28th, didn't gain any real traction or make mainstream news because the media at large was still covering and reacting to very timely comments made by none other than Gregg Popovich just 3 days prior on November 25th, where he openly criticized his former superstar Kawhi Leonard and his leadership.
Well, I mean, Kawhi was a great player, but he wasn't the leader or anything. You know, Manu and Patty were the leaders. So Kawhi's talent would always be missed, but that leadership wasn't his deal at that time. You know, that may come as he progresses, but, you know, Patty and Manu filled that role for us last year, and LaMarcus came a long way in that regard also. And that, well, I'll leave it at that.
Now, while some may see Gregg Popovich's words as nothing more than an opinion, it is important to note that in 2016, Gregg Popovich was singing a very different tune and in fact had compared Kawhi Leonard to Tim Duncan when it came to leadership.
Would you want Kawhi to be more of a vocal guy, or is he
Absolutely.
just more...
No, absolutely. You know, he's not going to be as vocal as Patty Mills. It's not who he is. He's not Avery Johnson. You know, he does it differently. He's a little bit more like Timmy. He's going to lead by example. He's going to say after practice, come early to practice hard while he's here, and that'll probably be his major type of leadership, just like it was Timmy's. But after that, he's talking to people a whole lot more, and I do want him to communicate, as you say, on the floor more and more all the time.
Now, this isn't to demonize Gregg Popovich and the Spurs' medical staff, or to discredit what they've been able to accomplish over the past 20 to 25 years, but it is to show that they aren't as perfect as their reputation might suggest, which extends to the organization as a whole. Whether it's their general manager R.C. Buford, who was once arrested and charged with possession of an open container and a DUI after crashing his car into a fence in 2011, or Tony Parker, who is by far the best point guard in the franchise's history, but who has been the subject of numerous unflattering tabloid stories over the years. And even Tim Duncan, who typically keeps a low profile, had somewhat of a messy public divorce while he was still playing. So while the media has oftentimes led us to believe that the Spurs run a tight ship and are low-key in terms of off-court drama, the reality is that these attributes don't always align with everything they do and who they are. That being said, what we also know about the Spurs as an organization is that they have drafted relatively well over the years, have done an exceptional job in terms of player development, and have not only received great coaching from Gregg Popovich, but have also had many current and former NBA coaches come from the Popovich tree. They are also perhaps the best example of how smart team management can supersede any constrictions caused by market size, television exposure, and name brand recognition. However, all of those moving pieces mean absolutely nothing if they aren't anchored by a transcendent superstar talent. And what we observed last season from the Spurs was a blatant dismissal of that talent in favor of the organization. But void of that talent, all the Spurs are at this point are just another well-run basketball team that's good enough to compete, but not great enough to contend. Which is exactly what they were in 1996 before the arrival of Tim Duncan.
I heard about it, but you know, it's just funny to me because, you know, I don't know if he's talking about last year or not, but I guess when you stop playing, I forget how you lead. But other than that, I mean, it doesn't matter. I'm here with the Raptors, and I'm focused on the season and not what's going on the other side.
What kind of a leader?
Lead by example, coming into practice every day.
He's a little bit more like Timmy. He's going to lead by example. He's going to stay after practice, come early to practice hard while he's here. And that'll probably be his major type of leadership, just like it was Timmy's.
You're going to win it in San Antonio.
Go to San Antonio where they turned the AC off. They won that one game because they were cheaters. See, they got to win. Hold on, listen. They won, but they cheated. See, they practiced with no heat.
Oh, they practiced with no heat. Do you know that for a fact?
Of course I do.
Oh, okay.
Of course
Who's
I do.
your source on that?
No, it's the streets.
The streets have pro talent. What's up?
I'm going to tell you what it is. I'm going to keep it real.